December 7, 1941. Japan attacks Pearl Harbor with the world's most powerful navy, confident their 6 million tons of merchant shipping and elite submarine force will dominate the Pacific. 4 years later, Japanese admirals stood in shock, staring at reports they refused to believe. American submarines had sunk over 1,200 of their ships, systematically strangling Japan's economy while their own superior submarine fleet barely made a dent. But how did the United States, a nation Japan dismissed as soft and materialistic, build a silent underwater armada that won the war before a single decisive battle was ever fought? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. December 7, 1941. The morning sun rose over Pearl Harbor as Japanese carrier planes screamed down from the clouds. Admiral Fukudome Shigeru stood aboard the flagship Nagato in Japan's inland sea, receiving the first reports of success. 8 American battleships damaged or sunk, hundreds of aircraft destroyed on the ground, fewer than 30 Japanese planes lost. The news spread through the combined fleet headquarters like electricity. Officers cheered. Junior staff bowed deeply toward the Emperor's palace in Tokyo. Japan had struck the decisive blow that would secure Asia for the empire. Fukudome was 52 years old, a career officer who had spent 30 years studying surface warfare. He believed in battleships the way priests believe in scripture. His entire strategic vision centered on one idea: the great decisive battle. Somewhere in the Pacific, the Japanese and American fleets would meet. Giant guns would roar. The superior training and fighting spirit of Japanese sailors would prevail. The enemy would surrender. This was how wars were won. This was how nations proved their greatness. In the operations room, maps covered every wall. Blue pins marked Japanese positions across the newly conquered empire. Red pins showed American bases, growing fewer each day. The Dutch East Indies oil fields would soon belong to Japan. Rice from Indochina, rubber from Malaya, iron ore from China and the Philippines. The resources of half of Asia flowing toward the home islands on 6 million tons of merchant shipping. Fukudome looked at those shipping routes with satisfaction. Thousands of cargo vessels moving oil, food, and raw materials, the lifeblood of the empire. A young lieutenant commander named Hashimoto Mochitsura entered the operations room carrying a thin folder. He was 28, assigned to track merchant vessel movements and losses. Hashimoto approached carefully and bowed. "Admiral, the morning shipping report." Fukudome barely glanced at it. 3 merchant ships reported overdue in the South China Sea, probably weather delays or radio problems. Hashimoto hesitated, then spoke again. "Sir, one vessel reported a torpedo attack before losing contact. They said it was a submarine." Fukudome waved his hand dismissively. American submarines. He had read the intelligence reports. The United States Navy operated perhaps 60 submarines in the Pacific. Their torpedoes were known to malfunction, running too deep or failing to explode. Their crews were untested in combat. Japanese submarines, by contrast, were the finest in the world. The Type 93 long lance torpedo could strike from 9 miles away. Japanese submarine commanders were hand-picked veterans. If anyone should fear submarine warfare, it was the Americans. "One ship," Fukudome said, "among thousands. Note it in the log and continue." Hashimoto bowed and left. But the young officer felt a small seed of doubt. One ship today. What about tomorrow? Across the headquarters, Captain Orita Zenji sat in a smaller office reviewing patrol reports from Japanese submarines. Orita was different from most naval officers. He had spent 2 years training with the German Navy before the war, learning their submarine tactics. He understood what submarines could do when used correctly. The Germans were sinking hundreds of Allied merchant ships in the Atlantic. Not by fighting battleships, not by seeking glorious surface combat, by hunting cargo vessels, tankers, and supply ships, by cutting the enemy's lifelines. Orita had tried to share these ideas with the naval staff. He wrote reports suggesting Japan develop similar tactics, hunt American supply lines, target their tankers and cargo ships, force their fleet to protect convoys instead of seeking battle. But the senior admirals did not want to hear it. Submarine warfare was not honorable, it was not decisive. The true purpose of submarines was reconnaissance and supporting the main fleet battle. Sinking unarmed merchant ships was work for lesser nations, not for samurai sailors of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Still, Orita kept his records. He noted that in December 1941, American submarines sank 4 Japanese merchant vessels. In January 1942, they sank 7 more. In February, 9. The numbers were small, but they were growing. Each loss was investigated and classified. Some officers blamed mines, others blamed operational accidents or storms. Very few wanted to admit that American submarines might be responsible. The political climate in Tokyo made such admissions difficult. The government promoted absolute confidence in Japanese superiority. Newspapers printed stories about American weakness and decadence. Radio broadcasts mocked American fighting spirit. The official doctrine taught that Japanese soldiers and sailors possessed Yamato Damashi, the spirit of Japan, which made them invincible. How could a nation of soft, materialistic Americans possibly threaten the divine empire? Economic planners in Tokyo calculated Japan's needs with precision. The home islands produced almost no oil. Every drop came from tankers sailing from the Dutch East Indies. Japan's steel mills required constant shipments of iron ore from the mainland. The population depended on rice imports from Korea and Indochina. If shipping stopped, everything stopped. But the planners were confident. 6 million tons of merchant ship seemed like an endless reserve. Lose a few dozen ships, build more. The convoy routes stretched across thousands of miles of ocean. How could American submarines, few in number and poor in performance, possibly threaten such a vast system? In the operations room, Fukudome studied maps of recent carrier strikes. Japanese forces had swept through the Philippines, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies with stunning speed. Every week brought news of fresh victories. The admiral barely noticed when Hashimoto delivered the next shipping report. 15 vessels overdue or confirmed in March. 21 in April. The numbers appeared as small footnotes in daily briefings. Fukudome's attention remained fixed on planning the next carrier operation, the next surface engagement, the next step toward the decisive battle that would end the war. But in a corner office, Hashimoto began keeping a separate ledger. He recorded every merchant ship loss, every tanker that failed to arrive, every cargo vessel that went silent mid-voyage. The young officer did not yet understand what he was documenting. He simply followed orders and kept accurate records. The pattern was still too small to see, just numbers in a ledger, just pins on a map, just the first quiet ripples of a tsunami that would drown the empire. By August 1942, Hashimoto's ledger had grown thick with entries. He sat at his desk in the dim operations room, adding up columns of numbers by lamplight. 50 merchant ships confirmed sunk, another 30 probably lost but unconfirmed, 70 more damaged and limping back to port for repairs. The young officer's hand trembled slightly as he wrote the total at the bottom of the page. In 8 months of war, Japan had lost over 150 vessels to all causes. He separated the losses by type. Aircraft attacks accounted for perhaps 20 ships. Mines claimed another 15. Storms and accidents took 10 more. That left nearly 100 vessels. Hashimoto circled that number: American submarines. He carried his report to Admiral Fukudome the next morning. The admiral was planning carrier operations near Guadalcanal, moving wooden ship models across a large table map. Hashimoto waited until acknowledged, then presented his findings. Fukudome wagged the first page and frowned. "These numbers seem high. Have you verified each loss?" Hashimoto nodded. Yes, sir. I contacted every naval district, I reviewed survivor reports, I cross-checked with convoy records. The admiral studied the report more carefully now. 100 ships in 8 months. That was more than one vessel every 2 days. What percentage do you attribute to submarines? Fukudome asked. Hashimoto swallowed. Approximately 60%, sir, possibly higher. The admiral set the report down slowly. 60%? That could not be correct. Intelligence estimated the Americans had perhaps 70 submarines in the Pacific. Many were old S-class boats from the First World War. Their torpedoes were notoriously faulty. Just last month, a Japanese destroyer had been struck by 3 American torpedoes that failed to explode. How could such an incompetent force be sinking 60 ships? Fukudome ordered a full investigation. Staff officers spent 2 weeks reviewing every loss. They interviewed survivors. They studied attack reports. They examined wreckage when available. The conclusion came back unchanged. American submarines were responsible for at least 60% of merchant ship losses, perhaps more. The attacks were spreading across the entire Pacific, from the waters off Japan itself to the shipping lanes near Singapore. No route seemed safe. In October 1942, an intelligence report arrived from naval headquarters that made Fukudome stop breathing for a moment. American submarine production estimates had been revised upward. The United States was not building 1 or 2 submarines per year like Japan. They were launching 2 to 3 new fleet submarines every single month. Fukudome read the number 3 times to be sure he understood. 3 submarines per month, 36 per year. The report included photographs taken by a spy near San Francisco. The images showed Mare Island Naval Shipyard. Fukudome stared at the pictures in disbelief. The shipyard looked like an automobile factory. Long assembly buildings stretched in rows. Giant cranes moved hull sections like toy blocks. The photographs showed 6 submarine hulls under construction simultaneously in a single yard. The intelligence summary noted that America had multiple yards building submarines. Mare Island, Portsmouth, Manitoba, Electric Boat. Each yard launching boats in a steady stream. The report estimated total American submarine strength would reach 150 boats by the end of 1943. Fukudome called for Captain Arita. The submarine warfare expert arrived within the hour. "Is this possible?" Fukudome asked, spreading the photographs across his desk. Arita studied them carefully. "Yes, sir, this is mass production. The Americans build submarines the way they build cars. Standardized parts, assembly line methods, multiple shifts working day and night." Fukudome felt something cold settle in his stomach. Japan's shipyards built submarines one at a time, carefully crafted by master workers. It took 18 months to complete a single boat. "How many submarines can we build per year?" he asked quietly. Arita hesitated. "Perhaps 20, sir, if we push production to maximum." The mathematics were simple and terrible. Japan would build 20 submarines in a year. America would build 70 or 80. The gap would widen every month. And American submarines were hunting Japanese merchants, while Japanese submarines were ordered to hunt American warships. Arita had tried to explain this before. Japanese submarine doctrine considered merchant ships unworthy targets. Submarines should strike carriers and battleships, supporting the decisive fleet battle. But carriers and battleships were heavily defended and fast-moving. Cargo ships and tankers were slow and often sailed alone. In November, the tanker losses began to hurt. Japan's oil came exclusively from the Dutch East Indies, transported by tanker fleets across 2,000 miles of ocean. That month, American submarines sank 8 tankers. In December, they sank 11 more. Fukudome received urgent messages from the Naval Fuel Depot. Oil reserves were falling below comfortable levels. Could the combined fleet reduce training exercises to conserve fuel? The admiral authorized reduced steaming time for the first time since the war began. Battleships and carriers that once practiced constantly now sat in port more often, saving precious fuel oil. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So, if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Hashimoto's ledger grew thicker. January 1943, February, March. Each month brought new pages of losses. 200 ships sunk, then 250, then 300. The young officer began receiving reports that frightened him. American submarines were no longer working alone. Radio intercepts revealed they were talking to each other in codes Japan could not break. 3 or 4 submarines would gather near a convoy route and attack in coordination, like wolves hunting deer. The Americans called these groups wolf packs, copying German tactics from the Atlantic. In April, something even more disturbing appeared in intelligence reports. A captured American submarine crewman was brought to Tokyo for questioning. The sailor was 23 years old, sunburned and thin, but not particularly scared. The interrogators asked how many submarines America had in the Pacific now. The young American shrugged. "I don't know exactly. Maybe 150? Could be more. They keep building them." The interrogators wrote this down, but added a note that the prisoner was probably lying or misinformed. 150 submarines seemed impossible. Fukudome ordered verification through other intelligence sources, naval spies, radio intercepts, reconnaissance flights over American bases. Every source confirmed the same basic picture. The United States Navy had deployed over 120 submarines to the Pacific by mid-1943. Another 30 were in training or transit. Production continued at 3 boats per month. The numbers were real. Admiral Fukudome stood alone in the operations room late one night in May. The map of the Pacific covered the wall. Red pins marked submarine attacks. There were hundreds of them now, scattered across every shipping route. He had always imagined defeating America in a great surface battle. Carriers against carriers, battleships firing salvos across blue water. The decisive engagement that would settle the war in an afternoon. But this was different. This was slow strangulation. Every week, more ships disappeared. More oil failed to arrive. More rice shipments went to the bottom. This was not warfare as he understood it. This was arithmetic. Cold, patient, mathematical destruction. And for the first time since Pearl Harbor, Admiral Fukudome felt genuine fear. June 19, 1944. Admiral Fukudome stood on the bridge of the carrier Zuikaku somewhere in the Philippine Sea. The greatest carrier battle of the war was unfolding around him. Japanese planes launched toward the American fleet in wave after wave. This was supposed to be the decisive battle, the moment Japan had prepared for, the engagement that would turn the tide of war. But something was terribly wrong. The fuel gauges on every ship read dangerously low. Carriers that should have been full of oil were operating on reserves. The fleet had barely enough fuel to fight this battle and return to base. The reason sat in Fukudome's briefing folder: tanker losses. In the past 6 months, American submarines had sunk 38 tankers traveling from the Dutch East Indies. 38 vessels that should have delivered oil to fuel depots were resting on the ocean floor instead. The mobile fleet had been forced to refuel at Tawi-Tawi near Borneo, far from normal bases, because fuel was too scarce to waste on long transit voyages. Even there, the tankers arrived sporadically, always fewer than expected, always late. Then the radio message arrived that changed everything. 2 explosions had been heard from the carrier Taiho. She was the newest and largest carrier in the fleet, barely 6 months old. Minutes later, another message. Carrier Shakaku hit by multiple torpedoes. Fukudome rushed to the radio room. Both reports mentioned the same cause: submarine attacks. American submarines had penetrated the screening destroyers and struck at the heart of the carrier fleet. Within hours, both carriers were gone. Taiho exploded from accumulated gasoline fumes, Shakaku rolled over and sank. 2 fleet carriers lost not to aircraft or surface combat, but to submarines lurking beneath the waves. Fukudome returned to his cabin that night while Zuikaku retreated westward. He spread his maps across the desk and truly looked at them for the first time in months. Red pins marked submarine attacks. They covered the map like a rash. The shipping lanes from the Dutch East Indies were thick with pins. The routes from Singapore showed dozens more. Even the waters near Japan itself bristled with markers. He opened the latest loss report. As of June 1, 1944, American submarines had sunk over 600 Japanese merchant vessels. 600! The number seemed impossible, but the documentation was thorough. Names of ships, dates of attacks, locations, cargo manifests showing what went down with each vessel. He read through the cargo losses. 200,000 tons of oil, 150,000 tons of rice, 90,000 tons of coal, 60,000 tons of iron ore, 40,000 tons of rubber. The empire was bleeding resources into the Pacific faster than the home islands could consume them. Factory production was falling because raw materials arrived irregularly. The population was beginning to face rice shortages because cargo ships kept disappearing. The military was rationing fuel because tankers never completed their voyages. Captain Orita entered the cabin carrying another folder. He had been promoted to fleet staff, one of the few officers who understood submarine warfare. "Admiral, the November assessment you requested." Fukudome took the report with heavy hands. The summary page showed numbers that made his chest tighten. Japanese merchant fleet strength in December 1941 had been 6 million tons. Current strength as of June 1944 was 4 million tons. 2 million tons lost in 30 months. The report projected that, at current loss rates, Japan's merchant fleet would be reduced to 2 million tons by mid-1945. Below 2 million tons, the report stated in dry language, the empire could not sustain military operations or feed the civilian population. Orita spoke quietly. "Sir, we are losing this war in a way our doctrine never anticipated. We prepared to fight battleships with battleships, carriers with carriers, the decisive engagement where superior spirit would prevail. But the Americans are not fighting that war. They are cutting our supply lines. They are sinking our cargo ships and tankers. They are starving the empire." Fukudome looked up at him. "And our submarines? What have they accomplished?" Orita's face was grave. "Our submarines have sunk 2 American carriers, 1 cruiser, and several destroyers across the entire war. Perhaps 10 enemy warships total. American submarines have sunk 600 of our merchant ships and are approaching 4 million tons of shipping destroyed." The contrast was staggering. Japanese submarines, the finest in the world according to pre-war doctrine, had hunted warships and found few targets. American submarines, dismissed as inferior, had hunted everything and destroyed an economy. Fukudome stood and walked to the window. The dark Pacific stretched endlessly. Beneath those waves, American submarines were hunting right now. Patient, methodical, unstoppable. He thought about the intelligence reports on American submarine production. The United States now had over 200 submarines in the Pacific. Japan had perhaps 60 operational boats. American submarines were resupplied from advanced bases with unlimited torpedoes. Japanese submarines often returned to port with unused torpedoes because they found no worthy targets. American crews rotated regularly, staying fresh and aggressive. Japanese crews stayed on patrol until exhausted, bound by the code that retreat was shameful. Fukudome sat down and began writing in his personal journal, something he rarely did. The words came slowly at first, then faster. "We believed American wealth made them soft. We believed our fighting spirit made us strong. We were wrong. American wealth built 200 submarines. American industry supplied them with unlimited torpedoes. American pragmatism directed them to hunt our weakest point. They understood modern war better than we did. War is not spiritual. War is industrial. War is mathematics. A nation needs oil to move ships, steel to build weapons, food to feed soldiers. The Americans understood this. We understood only honor and glory. He paused, pen hovering over paper. Our submarines sink warships because warships are honorable targets. Their submarines sink cargo ships because cargo ships carry the resources that enable war. We chose pride. They chose effectiveness. We are losing because effectiveness defeats pride every time. A hungry pilot cannot fly no matter how brave he is. A carrier without fuel cannot launch planes no matter how skilled the crew. Spirit cannot conjure oil from empty tanks. Courage cannot conjure rice from sunken holds. The next morning, Fukudome attended a staff meeting where officers discussed plans for the next great naval battle. They spoke of luring American carriers into a trap, of combining land-based aircraft with the fleet, of one final decisive engagement. Fukudome listened and said nothing. He understood now that the decisive battle would never come. The Americans would not cooperate. They would continue their submarine campaign, sinking ships, cutting supply lines, letting Japan strangle slowly. The war was already lost. It had been lost in the cargo holds of 600 sunken merchant ships, lost in the engine rooms of 40 tankers resting on the ocean floor, lost in the industrial shipyards of America that built submarines faster than Japan could sink them. That night, Fukudome stood on deck and watched the stars. Somewhere below, American submarines were hunting, silent, patient, winning. A war the Japanese admirals never understood they were fighting until it was far too late to matter. August 15, 1945. Admiral Fukudome listened to the Emperor's voice on the radio, announcing Japan's surrender. The broadcast was scratchy and hard to hear, but the meaning was clear. The war was over. Japan had lost. Fukudome sat in his office at naval headquarters in Tokyo, surrounded by maps that no longer mattered. The final shipping report lay on his desk. He had read it 3 times, each reading making the reality harder to deny. American submarines had sunk 1,178 Japanese merchant vessels, over 5 million tons of shipping destroyed. 52% of all Japanese shipping losses came from submarines alone.
He picked up another document, the final assessment of Japanese submarine effectiveness. Across 4 years of war, Japanese submarines had sunk 2 American carriers, 1 cruiser, 3 destroyers, and perhaps a dozen merchant ships. Total enemy tonnage sunk was less than 200,000 tons. The contrast was so extreme it felt like reading about 2 different wars. American submarines sank over 5 million tons. Japanese submarines sank less than 200,000. The ratio was roughly 25-1. The numbers told a story that Fukudome finally understood completely. Japan had built submarines to hunt warships. America had built submarines to destroy an economy. Japan had followed the code of Bushido, seeking honorable combat. America had followed the logic of industrial warfare, seeking maximum damage to enemy capability. Honor had lost to efficiency so badly it was almost embarrassing to document. In September, Fukudome traveled back to his family home near Hiroshima. The train ride took 14 hours because so many rail lines were damaged. He stared out the window at the devastated landscape. Cities bombed flat. Factories silent and empty. Harbors that once bustled with merchant ships now held only sunken wrecks and rusting hulls. At one station, he watched dock workers unloading supplies from an American cargo ship. The food and medicine were gifts from the occupying forces. Japan could no longer feed itself. The submarine campaign had cut food imports by 40%. Combined with destroyed farmland and disrupted distribution, the result was widespread hunger. Fukudome thought about something he had learned from an intelligence report late in the war. American prisoners of war held in Japanese camps had received better rations than Japanese civilians by 1945. The irony was bitter. Japan starved its own people while feeding enemy prisoners the minimum calories to survive. And even that minimum was more than many Japanese families had. All because American submarines had sunk the cargo ships carrying rice from Southeast Asia. At home, his wife and children greeted him with tears of relief. They had survived the war, though his oldest son had died flying a kamikaze mission in April. Fukudome held his wife and felt the sharpness of her bones through her clothing. She had lost 30 pounds. Everyone had. He opened his travel bag and distributed the military rations he had saved. Rice balls, dried fish, a can of fruit. His family ate slowly, making each bite last. His youngest daughter, now 12, asked him a question. "Father, why did we lose the war?" Fukudome looked at her thin face and tried to find simple words for a complex answer. "We thought we were stronger than we were," he said quietly. "We thought our spirit made us powerful. But modern war is not about spirit. It is about factories and resources and supply lines. America had more of everything. More ships, more planes, more submarines, more steel and oil and food. We could not match their production. And their submarines cut off our supplies from other countries. So we became weaker while they became stronger. Spirit alone cannot win wars." In October, Captain Arita visited. The two men walked through the ruins of Hiroshima, though they avoided the area near the atomic bomb site. Arita had brought his notes and records from the war. He was writing a book about submarine warfare, trying to document what had happened so future generations might learn. "The final count is confirmed," Arita said. 1,178 merchant ships sunk by American submarines. The Naval Ministry verified every loss. The documentation is complete.
Fukudome asked the question that haunted him. Could we have stopped them? If we had changed our tactics early, used our submarines differently, protected our convoys better? Arita was quiet for a long time. Perhaps we could have reduced the losses. Better convoy escorts, more anti-submarine warfare training, routing ships away from known submarine zones. But stop them completely? No, sir. They had too many submarines. They built them faster than we could sink them. And they had something else. They had broken our naval codes. They knew where our ships would be before we sent them. Even our best efforts would have only delayed the inevitable. The code-breaking revelation had come out after surrender. American intelligence had cracked Japanese naval communications early in the war. They could read Japanese convoy routes, schedules, and positions. American submarines were not hunting blindly. They were being directed to exact locations where Japanese ships would appear. It was like shooting fish in a barrel when you knew exactly which barrel held the fish. Fukudome felt a wave of exhaustion thinking about it. Japan had fought a war with its plans exposed to the enemy from the beginning. In 1950, Fukudome took a position teaching at a maritime college. He lectured on naval strategy and the lessons of the Pacific War. His students were young men born during the war, now studying to rebuild Japan's merchant fleet. On the first day of class, he told them something he had learned in defeat. Before the war, I believed that courage and discipline were the most important qualities for victory. I was wrong. In modern warfare, industrial capacity and resource access matter more than courage. Logistics matter more than tactics. A brave soldier with no ammunition cannot fight. A disciplined sailor with no fuel cannot sail. America understood this. We did not. He showed them charts of submarine warfare effectiveness. The students stared in shocked silence at the numbers. One professor had survived the war as a merchant marine officer. He shared his experience. "I made 6 convoy runs during the war. Only 2 reached destination without being attacked. On my 4th voyage, an American submarine sank 3 ships from our convoy in 20 minutes. We could do nothing. Our escort destroyers were too slow, our detection equipment too primitive. The submarines attacked at night, invisible beneath the waves. By the time we knew they were there, ships were already sinking. Fukudome visited the Naval Museum at Kure in 1953. He stood before the massive battleship Yamato's anchor, one of the few pieces recovered after she sank. The Yamato had been the largest battleship ever built, 72,000 tons of steel, 18-inch guns that could fire a shell 25 miles. She was supposed to be the ultimate weapon, the ship that would win the decisive battle. Instead, she was sunk by American aircraft in April 1945 while sailing on a one-way suicide mission. She barely had enough fuel to reach Okinawa because submarine attacks had destroyed the tanker fleet. An American naval officer was visiting the museum that day, part of the occupation forces. He introduced himself politely. They talked about the war. The American asked Fukudome what surprised him most about the submarine campaign. Fukudome thought carefully before answering. "We knew America was wealthy. We called you materialistic, as if that was weakness. We did not understand that materialism, as you call it, is the foundation of modern military power. You built 288 submarines during the war. You produced unlimited torpedoes. You had the industrial base to sustain a campaign that lasted 4 years without pause. We had tradition and honor and fighting spirit. You had factories and resources and systematic planning. The factories won." The American nodded slowly. "Our submarines were good boats with good crews, but you are right that industrial capacity made the difference. We could replace losses, we could keep submarines supplied and maintained. We had advanced bases across the Pacific. We had code breakers telling us where your ships would be. All of those advantages came from having resources and using them efficiently." Fukudome walked home through the rebuilt streets of Kure. The harbor was busy again with merchant ships, though they flew different flags now and carried different cargo. He thought about his daughter's question from years ago. Why did we lose? The answer was in the numbers. 1,178 ships sunk, 5 million tons destroyed, an economy strangled, an empire starved. All done by submarines that Japanese admirals had dismissed as insignificant at the war's beginning. He understood now what he had refused to see in 1941. Modern war was not romantic. It was not about samurai spirit or glorious battle. It was about mathematics and production and logistics. It was about oil in tanks and rice in holds and iron ore in cargo ships. Cut those supply lines and the mightiest fleet becomes worthless metal sitting in harbors. American submarines had taught that lesson perfectly. They had sunk over 1,000 ships, and with them, they had sunk an empire's illusions about what truly mattered in war. Reality had defeated ideology, just as it always does, just as it always will. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.